There were no trumpets, no army, no homecoming procession, only thick, cold darkness and the soft sound of donkey hooves touching the broken stones of Jerusalem. A small group of men, faces covered, moved silently through the ruined gates. No torches, no voices. No one could know they had entered the city that night, because if even one shadow saw them, the entire plan could die before morning. In the middle of them was a man who had just come from Persia. He did not carry a general's sword. He did not wear a king's robe. But the way he looked at those blackened walls was the way a man looks at a battlefield before war begins. Jerusalem was no longer a city. It was the corpse of a dream. The gates were burned. The walls lay collapsed like broken bones. The air was thick with the smell of old ash and defeat. That man had not come to weep over ruins. He had come from the Persian court, from the place where he once lifted a cup before the most powerful king in the world. A man who seemed born to stand in the gold light of a royal palace, not in the middle of rubble and danger. And yet the very next morning, he stepped out before a crowd of hopeless people and threw down one sentence like fire into dry wood.
"Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem."
And in that instant, everything began to move. Sanballat would hear the news. Tobiah would laugh. Geshem would step out of the shadows. And before the sun set again, the three most dangerous enemies in that entire region would begin hunting him. But the first thing Nehemiah discovered during that night's inspection was not only the fallen walls. He discovered a weakness deep enough to kill the whole campaign before the first stone was ever laid. Stay to the end of this story, because in those 52 days, soaked with sweat, blood, betrayal, and threats, the most dangerous thing was not only the enemy outside the city, it was the crack waiting to open from within. If you love Bible stories told with honesty, emotion, and cinematic depth, subscribe to Fidelia Bible Stories. It truly means a great deal to us. And now let us begin on the night Nehemiah entered a dead Jerusalem and decided he would force it to live again. That night, Jerusalem made no sound like a living city. There was no marketplace still awake, no hurried rhythm of pilgrims' footsteps, no line of warm lamplight glowed in the windows. The city lay before him like the skeleton of something vast that time and war had been gnawing at for too long. The gates were burned black. The broken walls lay in jagged heaps, like shattered bones rising from the earth. Wild grass pushed up through what had once been roads. Wind slipped through the cracks with a thin sound, like the whisper of a forgotten past. In the middle of that night, a small group of men rode slowly on donkeys, their faces covered. No torches, no banners. No one called out to another. Only the faint sound of hooves striking broken ground, and the breath of men who knew that if anyone saw them now, the entire mission could be crushed before it began. At the front rode Nehemiah. He did not speak much. His eyes moved across every stretch of collapsed wall, every burned gate, every blind corner where enemy eyes could be hidden. Some places were so ruined that the donkey could not even pass through. He had to climb down and walk, putting his hand on the cold stone, studying how deep the rubble ran, as though he wanted to force every image of it down into his heart before daybreak came. Nehemiah had not come to grieve. He had come to measure the battlefield, because by morning, if everything unfolded the way he intended, this dead city would hear one sentence strong enough either to bring it back to life or to kill it a second time. He kept everything absolutely secret. None of the nobles, officials, priests, or influential men in the city knew where he had gone or what he was planning. He could not let the news leak out. Not only because the people were afraid, but because there were other eyes around Jerusalem, waiting for the smallest sign so they could crush hope while it was still only a seed. By dawn, the group had returned, and the next morning, Nehemiah was no longer a hidden figure in the dark. He stepped out openly, no evasive words, no delay. He gathered the officials, the priests, the nobles, the workers, the faces of what was left of a people who had grown used to living in disgrace. Perhaps they came with tired eyes, cautious eyes, half-believing eyes, because by then, the Jews did not lack sorrow. What they lacked was the belief that sorrow could still end. And Nehemiah spoke straight as the first hammer blow against stone.
"You see the trouble we are in. how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision."
That one sentence struck the dead air like a spear. It was both an invitation and an ultimatum. Either they would rise, or they would accept that their children and grandchildren would be born and die in these ruins forever. And exactly as Nehemiah expected, the moment that call went out, the darkness around the city began to move. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the three most hostile powers in that land, a Samaritan, an Ammonite, an Arab. Three names like three beasts smelling blood the moment life began to stir inside a corpse. They did not want Jerusalem to rise. A city with walls is a city with will. And a people with will are harder to rule, harder to mock, harder to turn into puppets. So Sanballat mocked them. Tobiah ridiculed them.
"What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?"
That question was not just a threat, it was a blade aimed directly at the mission as a whole. Enemies do not always come with swords. Sometimes they come with contempt. They make what you are doing look small, foolish, and useless. But Nehemiah did not step back. He answered,
"The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem."
And with that, the countdown began. But one great question still hung in many minds. Who was this man daring to speak as though he could push back an entire hostile region by sheer resolve? To understand that you have to go back 4 months. Susa, no dust, no broken walls, no burned gates, only palace halls, polished corridors, tall, cold columns, thick carpets that swallowed footsteps, fine wine. Servants who spoke as softly as air, and in the middle of that splendor stood a man close to the greatest power in the world. Doing a task that was both an honor and a danger every single day, he served wine to the king. Nehemiah was cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. It sounds elegant, but in truth, it meant living next to death. Every cup he handed to the king could be his own last if poison had been slipped into it. He tasted first. He walked with calm, courtly precision, but his life always hung in the balance between palace intrigue and the unpredictable temper of a Persian ruler. Not everyone who stands near a throne has power. Some stand near a throne because they are trusted enough to die first. And in that palace, in the middle of all the silk and gold, Nehemiah received word from Jerusalem. The walls were broken down, the gates had been burned. The survivors there were living in great trouble and shame. That news did not merely make him sad, it broke something inside him. He sat down and wept. He fasted. He prayed for many days. Not a quick flash of emotion, but 4 slow-burning months in which a man kept his royal composure on the outside, while inside him, a great risk was growing with every prayer. Because in Susa, to appear sad before the king was dangerous. The king did not want darkness in his court. Sadness could be interpreted as dissatisfaction, political unrest, or a sign of loyalty beginning to crack. It could become a death sentence. Nehemiah knew that. He also knew he would have only one moment to gamble his life with the grief he carried for his people. Then the day came. He lifted the wine, walked through the familiar halls, stood before the king, and for the first time he did not fully hide the sorrow in his face. The king noticed immediately and asked,
"Why is your face sad? Seeing you are not sick, this is nothing but sadness of the heart."
That was the moment that could have killed him. Nehemiah says he was very much afraid. Then he answered,
"Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?"
Then came the question that changed everything.
"What are you requesting?"
Perhaps Nehemiah's whole body went cold, because all those months of prayer now came down to one breath. He prayed silently to the God of heaven. Then he answered. He asked to go. He asked to rebuild the city. He asked for letters, granting him passage through the provinces beyond the river. He asked for timber from Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress for the city wall, and for the house he himself would occupy. This was not reckless courage without direction. This was prepared boldly, months of prayer. Then when the door opened, he knew exactly what to ask for. and the most powerful king in the world agreed. Not only did he agree, but he also gave him officers and horse riders as an escort. So the cupbearer became the builder. Not through some sentimental miracle, but through 4 months of prayer, 1 moment of laying his life on the table, and a mind that had already prepared its list. Then he came to Jerusalem, and now after that night inspection and that declaration at dawn, the city began to move. Families rose, priests rose, artisans rose, merchants rose. The names of the gates began to be spoken again, as if memory itself were waking. The sheep gate, the fish gate, the old gate, the dung gate, the fountain gate, the east gate. Each person took responsibility for the stretch of wall nearest his own house. No one had the strength to rebuild the whole city, but the whole city could rise if each man took hold of the disgrace lying right outside his own door. And so the worksite came alive. But Sanballat and Tobiah did not merely stand and watch. The higher the wall rose, the sharper their mockery became. They sneered. They called the Jews weak. They asked whether those burned stones could live again. Tobiah added,
Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall.
But laughter was not enough anymore. When the wall began to close up, when the gaps grew smaller, when disgrace began turning into real defense, the enemies moved from mockery to bloodshed. Intelligence reports kept pouring in. 10 times over, 10 times the Jews living near the enemy came running breathless, saying the attack would come from every direction. From here, from there, from the north, from the south, from the east, from the west. And while the workers were still carrying heavy stones, while the mortar was still wet, while the whole city was already exhausted to the breaking point, the thought of a surprise attack stretched every back another inch tighter. So Nehemiah turned the worksite into a training ground for war. He stationed guards in the lowest and exposed places. He arranged the people by families with swords, spears, and bows. Then he looked at the faces gone pale from fear and exhaustion and said,
Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.
From that point on, the work took on a completely different shape. It was no longer simply a building, it was building and surviving. Scripture says, those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. Nehemiah 4:17. That image makes the whole story blaze with a fierce kind of glory. One hand on the brick, one hand on the sword. The line between labor and battle disappeared. Bodies bent down to lift stones, but eyes kept scanning the distance. Swords hung at their sides, even while they mixed mortar. Guards stood behind the builders. At night, they did not go home. They slept where they worked. They did not take off their clothes, except perhaps to wash. No one allowed himself to relax truly, because one moment of ease could mean the enemy's blade across the whole site. And Nehemiah built something more for those days, when no one had enough strength to guard every weak point and run from place to place a trumpet. He said,
In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us.
From that point on, the whole city lived in a posture of readiness. Every hammer strike, every stone lifted, every section of wall joined together carried the tension. That perhaps in the next second, the trumpet would sound, and everyone would have to drop the brick, draw the sword, and run to the most dangerous point. But then, just when the outside pressure was at its worst, the most painful blow came from within. Famine, hardship. Families were mortgaging their fields to buy grain. Jews charging interest to their own brothers. Some were even forced to sell their sons and daughters into slavery just to survive. Pause there. The wall was not even finished. The enemy was still standing outside, and right in the middle of that life and death struggle, the Jewish nobles were devouring their own brothers. The same hands gripping swords on the wall had blood relatives behind those walls being strangled by debt. When Nehemiah heard it, he did not overlook it for the sake of the bigger mission. He became angry, not a useless anger, but the anger of a man who understood that if the wall were rebuilt, while the heart of the people rotted sooner or later, the wall itself would become nothing more than a beautiful corpse. He rebuked the nobles and the officials. He called a great assembly against them. He reminded them that Jews had redeemed their brothers from foreign slavery. only now to sell them right back into bondage themselves. They had no answer. Then Nehemiah did something fierce.
So may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise.
He forced them to restore the fields, vineyards, houses, money, grain, wine, and oil immediately. And he did not only speak, he cut off his own allowance. For 12 years as governor, he refused to take the governor's food allowance the way previous governors had done. He fed many at his own table, paid from his own resources, and would not lay a burden on the people. That was when the people began to understand clearly that Nehemiah was not only rebuilding a wall, he was trying to rebuild a nation. When Sanballat saw that the wall was nearly closed, he changed tactics. Now came letters. One letter open for anyone to read. Its contents were slander. Nehemiah was preparing a rebellion. The Jews were building to become independent. Nehemiah was about to become king of Judah. Nehemiah sent back one sentence, cold and clean as steel.
No such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind.
But they still were not done. Now came bribery. A man named Shemaiah, who appeared private, pious, and trustworthy, lured Nehemiah into a trap far subtler than any sword. He had shut himself inside and spoke in a low, urgent tone, as though terrified because assassins were coming that very night. Then he urged Nehemiah to flee into the temple and lock the doors behind him. On the surface, it sounded wise, reasonable self-protection. But if Nehemiah had done that, he would have destroyed his own honor. A man who was not a priest, fleeing into a forbidden holy place to save himself. The people would hear of it and say,
"Our leader is so afraid of death that he hides inside the temple."
Nehemiah saw the trap, and he spoke a line with iron in its bones.
Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in.
He understood that some traps do not kill with knives. They kill through shame, through the destruction of reputation, through making the people lose trust in the one leading them. Then the 52nd day came. The wall was finished. Only 52 days, a number so astonishing that even the enemies fell silent for a moment. The men who had laughed at burned stones now stared at a completed wall rising from ruins in a span of time so short it looked as though an invisible hand had lifted every block. Scripture says the surrounding nations were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem because they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. If this were an ordinary story, it would end there. Trumpets sounding, people shouting. The leader smiles on the wall, bathed in golden light. But real life with God does not end beautifully simply because the project is done. Nehemiah had to return to Persia. He was still the king's servant. Duty called him back. Perhaps as he left Jerusalem with the wall standing strong, he thought the hardest part was over. Perhaps he believed the people had now learned shame, learned the fear of God, learned the cost of ruin, learned what that wall had cost in blood, sleeplessness, hunger, and tears. Perhaps he thought the city had finally learned its lesson. But when he returned after some time, he saw something even more painful than the ruins he had first found. Because fallen stones are easy to see, rotting hearts are not. Tobiah, the old enemy, now had a room for himself inside the temple. Feel the disgrace of that. A man who had opposed the work, mocked the wall, and wanted the city crushed, had now been given a chamber in the holy place itself. No siege, no military assault. He entered through relationships, through compromise, soft as cloth and poisonous as mold. The Sabbath was being trampled. Merchants did business at the gates. The gates that had been rebuilt through danger were now becoming openings for profit and irrelevance. The Levites were no longer being supported, so they had abandoned their duties. The people had intermarried. Their children spoke the language of Ashdod more than the language of Judah. Identity itself was beginning to blur inside the very city that had just been rebuilt. And this is where Nehemiah no longer looks like the calm cupbearer from Susa. He is no longer the man riding quietly through the city at night. He becomes sharp, severe, almost violent with urgency, like someone whose entire nervous system has been built by long vigilance, only now to watch everything he fought to protect begin rotting behind the walls. He entered Tobiah's room and threw all his furniture out. Then he ordered the rooms cleaned. He rebuked the nobles for profaning the Sabbath. He ordered the gates shut before the Sabbath and not opened until it was over. When merchants still lingered outside the wall, he went out and warned them directly that if they did it again, he would lay hands on them. Then came the matter of intermarriage. This time Nehemiah did not speak gently. He cursed some of them. He beat some of them. He pulled out their hair. It sounds almost unbelievable in its severity, but that is exactly the point. Scripture does not beautify the leader. It shows a man who has come to the end of his patience because he understands that when a nation loses its covenant identity, every wall will sooner or later become nothing more than stacked stones. So the story does not close with a bright dedication ceremony. It closes with a weary man standing in a city he loves, cleaning up one more ruin, not with stone, but with human hearts. No more hammer blows ringing out like in the beginning. No more adrenaline of the 52 days of blood and stone. Only dust weariness and the painful knowledge that building something great is hard, but keeping it from rotting inside is harder still. Nehemiah looked up to heaven and whispered a prayer, no longer heroic, only honest.
Remember me, O my God.
That is a haunting ending, not a shout, a breath, not a wreath of victory, a plea to be remembered. Because in the end, Nehemiah had learned what every leader eventually learns through blood. You can rebuild a wall in 52 days, but you cannot keep rebuilding human hearts forever through brick, swords, and planning alone. If a city is to live, it needs more than walls. It needs a covenant. It needs the fear of God. It needs a restoration deeper than stone. And that is where this story reaches us. Some are standing in ruins and need to hear rise and rebuild. Some are living in comfort, yet carrying a sorrow they cannot shake. Some are building through hard days with one hand on the work and the other ready for battle. Some are surrounded by mockery, slander, and quiet opposition dressed in religious language. And some have built something beautiful, a family, a ministry, a calling, only to discover that the greatest danger is no longer outside, but within. Nehemiah reminds us that faithfulness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like sleepless nights, watchful hands, hard decisions, and the courage to clean out what has quietly gone rotten. But this story also reveals the limit of every human leader. Nehemiah could rebuild walls, but he could not remake hearts. That is why we need someone greater than Nehemiah. Nehemiah left a palace for a ruined city. Jesus left heaven for a ruined humanity. Nehemiah raised broken walls. Jesus restores broken souls. Nehemiah prayed, "Remember me." Through Jesus, we are remembered in grace. So if you are standing among broken stones today, do not lose heart. If you are tired of building and fighting at the same time, do not let go. And if something good in your life is beginning to rot from within, do not only repair the wall, bring your heart back to God. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "Lord, help me rebuild and keep my heart from drifting." And if you love Bible stories told in a seamless, emotional, cinematic way, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Fidelia Bible Stories, so that together we can keep stepping into stories that not only tell of walls being raised, but of the harder battle that comes after keeping what God builds from being ruined by the human heart.